Imagine standing in front of a furnace so hot that the air around you shimmers and bends. You are gripping a 20-pound iron rod, shoving it through a small opening in the furnace wall, and stirring a pool of molten pig iron by hand. The heat coming off that metal is somewhere around 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Your arms are burning, your lungs are filling with fumes, and you will do this for the next 2 hours, maybe 3, pulling and folding and raking that liquid metal until the carbon burns off and a blob of pasty iron comes together at the end of your rod. You will do this 6 times a day. And if you are like most of the men who did this work, you will be dead before you turn 40. This was the life of a puddler. And the furnace he worked in, the puddling furnace, is the single most important piece of industrial equipment that almost nobody talks about. Because before Henry Bessemer came along with his famous converter in 1856, before cheap steel existed, every railroad track, every iron bridge, every ship hull and factory beam in the industrialized world came out of a furnace just like this one. And the story of how it got there starts with a crisis that nearly killed the Industrial Revolution before it really got going. In the late 1700s, Britain had a problem that was getting worse by the year. The country was building machines at a pace the world had never seen. Steam engines were pumping water out of coal mines. Textile mills were spinning cotton into fabric. New factories were opening across the Midlands and the North. And every one of those machines, every frame and gear and axle, needed iron. But the iron coming out of British blast furnaces was pig iron, a brittle, carbon-heavy material that contained somewhere between 3.5% and 4.5% carbon by weight. That much carbon makes iron hard, yes, but it also makes it shatter like glass when you hit it. You cannot bend pig iron. You cannot hammer it into shape. Try to use it for a bridge beam or a rail and it will crack under load. What the builders and engineers needed was wrought iron, a tougher, more flexible version with almost all of the carbon removed. Wrought iron could be hammered, bent, welded, and shaped. It was the structural material of the age. But getting it was the bottleneck. The old method for converting pig iron into wrought iron was the finery forge. A finery forge used charcoal as its fuel, and it ate through forests at a terrifying rate. 4 tons of wood became 2 tons of charcoal, and those 2 tons of charcoal produced about 1 ton of refined iron. Britain had been feeding its iron industry this way for centuries, and by the 1750s, the country was running out of trees. Timber had become so scarce and expensive that ironworks had to set up in remote, heavily wooded areas just to stay near their fuel supply. Even then, they could not produce enough. Britain was forced to import large quantities of bar iron from Sweden and Russia, paying high prices for a material that it should have been making at home. Meanwhile, blast furnaces were running on coke, a coal product that Abraham Darby had proven could replace charcoal for smelting iron ore all the way back in 1709. Coke was cheap and plentiful. Coal mines were everywhere across northern England, Wales, and Scotland. So the front end of iron production was solved. You could melt iron ore and produce pig iron in enormous quantities using coke. But the back end, the hard part, converting that brittle pig iron into usable wrought iron, still required charcoal, and the charcoal was vanishing. Think about what that actually meant in practice. Britain could smelt all the pig iron it wanted, mountains of the stuff, but it could not turn that pig iron into the wrought iron that builders and engineers were screaming for without burning through forests that were already stripped bare. The country that was supposed to be leading the world in manufacturing could not supply its own most essential building material. Swedish bar iron, shipped across the North Sea, was cleaner and more reliable than almost anything British ironmasters could produce. Russian iron, coming out of the Ural Mountains, dominated European markets. British manufacturers were sending money overseas for a product they should have been making at home, and the bills kept climbing. That is the situation Henry Cort walked into. Cort was not a blacksmith or a furnace operator. He was born around 1740 in Lancaster, the son of a builder, and he ended up working as a civilian pay agent for the Royal Navy in London. His job was processing pensions and half pay for Navy officers and their widows. It was desk work, but it put him in daily contact with the Navy's supply chain, and the Navy was one of the biggest consumers of iron in the country. Anchors, cannons, chains, barrel hoops, hull fittings. All of it was iron, and Cort could see firsthand that the quality of British iron was poor compared to what was coming in from overseas. Swedish iron was cleaner, more consistent, and more expensive. And every year, the bills went up. By 1775, Cort had saved enough money to leave his government job and buy an ironworks at a place called Fontley, near the port of Gosport in Hampshire. He wanted to find a way to make better wrought iron using coal instead of charcoal. The idea was not unique to him. Plenty of ironmasters were chasing the same goal. A man named Peter Onions, working in Merthyr Tydfil in South Wales, had actually patented a process for stirring molten iron to refine it back in 1783. The Cranage brothers had experimented with reverberatory furnaces before that, but none of them had turned it into a complete, scalable system. Cort did. In 1783, he patented grooved rollers, a set of metal cylinders with channels cut into them that could press heated iron into bars and standardized shapes. Rolling replaced hammering, and it was roughly 15 times faster than shaping iron under a trip hammer. Then, in 1784, Cort patented his puddling furnace, and it is hard to overstate how much that second patent mattered. The puddling furnace was a reverberatory furnace, and that design is the key to the whole thing. In a traditional furnace or forge, the fuel sits right next to the metal. The fire touches the iron directly. That was fine when the fuel was charcoal, which burns clean. But coal contains sulfur, and sulfur poisons iron. It makes the metal crumbly and weak, a condition ironworkers called red short, because the iron would fall apart when heated to a red glow. Every attempt to refine iron with coal had run into this problem. Cort solved it by keeping the coal separate. In his furnace, the coal burned in a firebox at one end. The flames and hot gases rose up, swept across the arched ceiling of the furnace, and radiated down onto a shallow hearth where the pig iron sat on the other side of a low dividing wall. The metal melted from reflected heat, never touching the fuel. That separation meant you could burn coal all day and the sulfur stayed on its side of the wall. But melting the iron was only step one. The carbon still had to come out, and that is where the real work started. Before loading any iron, the puddler prepared the furnace by coating the hearth and walls with hematite, a reddish iron oxide. This step was called fettling, and it served two purposes. The coating protected the furnace lining from the extreme temperatures, and the iron oxide itself supplied extra oxygen that would help burn off impurities during the refining process. Then the puddler loaded 300 to 400 pounds of broken pig iron into the hearth and sealed the furnace door. As the temperature climbed, the iron melted into a shimmering pool. Carbon began to burn off. Carbon dioxide bubbled up through the liquid metal and made the layer of slag floating on top puff and swell. Experienced puddlers watched that slag carefully. The way it rose and shifted told them exactly how the refining was progressing. And then came the hardest part. The puddler picked up his rabbling bar, a long iron rod with a hook or a flat blade at the end, pushed it through a small opening in the furnace door, and started stirring. The goal was to expose as much of the molten iron to the air as possible, so the oxygen could strip out the carbon. He raked the metal back and forth, folded it over on itself, dragged it from one side of the hearth to the other. It was hot, heavy, miserable work, and it got worse as it went on. Because here is the chemistry that made this whole process so physically brutal. As carbon left the iron, the melting point of the remaining metal climbed. Pure iron melts at a much higher temperature than high-carbon pig iron, so the cleaner the iron got, the stiffer it became. What started as a liquid pool slowly turned into a thick, sticky paste, and the puddler had to fight his bar through heavier and heavier resistance with every passing minute. 2 hours of this, sometimes 3. His arms and back absorbing the strain while his face sat inches from a furnace, hot enough to blister skin from a distance. Eventually, the iron came together in large spongy masses called puddle balls, each one weighing roughly 80 to 90 pounds. The puddler hooked them onto the end of his bar and dragged them, one at a time, out of the furnace and onto the foundry floor. Those puddle balls were not finished iron. They were full of trapped slag and pockets of cinder. So the next stop was the shingling hammer, a massive steam-powered hammer that pounded the raw ball flat, squeezing out the slag and compressing the iron into a dense, workable block. After shingling, the block went through Cort's grooved rollers and came out as a bar of wrought iron, strong and flexible, and ready to be turned into whatever the industrial world needed. Rails, girders, chain links, anchor bolts, barrel hoops for the same Royal Navy that Cort used to work for. A puddler and his helper could run 5 or 6 of these cycles in a single 12-hour shift. That means a puddler was pulling somewhere around 2,000 pounds of iron out of the furnace every working day. By hand, one 80-pound ball at a time. His helper, called an underhand, did the loading and kept the furnace fed with coal and managed the tools. The two of them worked as a team, and both of them paid for it with their health. The floor of a puddling works was not a quiet place. Picture a long, low building, hot and dark, with a row of puddling furnaces glowing along one wall. Each furnace had a small square opening where you could see the orange light of the molten metal inside. The air was thick with coal smoke, steam, and the sharp smell of burning iron. Hammers were pounding nearby. Rollers were grinding. Men were shouting over the noise. And at every furnace, a puddler was bent forward, shoving his bar into the heat, arms shaking with the effort of stirring metal that did not want to move. The work killed them. This is not exaggeration. The historian David Landes described the puddlers as the aristocracy of the working class, proud and clannish, set apart by their labor. But he also noted that few of them lived past the age of 40. The heat exposure alone was devastating. Standing within arm's reach of molten iron for hours at a stretch, breathing in metallic fumes and coal smoke, wrestling a heavy rod through a substance that resisted more violently the longer you worked it. Their shoulders and arms broke down. Their lungs gave out. The job consumed their bodies in 20 years or less. And here is the thing that made the puddling furnace completely unique in the age of machines. It could never be automated. People tried. You can build a mechanical arm to stir a pool of metal, but you cannot build a machine that can feel the resistance changing in the rod as the carbon content drops. You cannot build a sensor that watches the way the slag moves and knows, from years of experience, that the iron is 30 seconds from being ready. The entire process depended on the judgment of the man at the furnace door. That meant you could not make the furnace bigger because one puddler could only handle so much iron. The average charge topped out somewhere between 600 and 900 pounds. You could not speed up the chemistry. The only way to make more iron was to build more furnaces and find more men willing to do the work. So that is exactly what Britain did. In 1784, the year Cort filed his patent, Britain was producing roughly 90,000 tons of iron per year. By 1800, with puddling furnaces spreading through South Wales, the Black Country around Birmingham, and into Scotland, production had passed 250,000 tons. By 1820, an estimated 8,200 puddling furnaces were operating across Europe, and annual British iron output hit 400,000 tons. By 1850, the number reached 2.25 million tons. Nearly all of the wrought iron in that total came through puddling furnaces. But Cort's original process had a limitation that nearly capped its growth. It worked best with high-quality pig iron made from certain ores, and it struggled with the cheaper, lower-grade iron that most British blast furnaces actually produced. The fix came in the early 1830s from a man named Joseph Hall, a former puddler himself who had been apprenticed to the trade back in 1806. Hall discovered that adding iron oxide, specifically a waste material called tap cinder, to the furnace charge caused the whole mixture to boil violently as the extra oxygen attacked the carbon. The boiling looked alarming, but once it settled, the iron that came out was cleaner and more consistent than anything Cort's original dry puddling had produced. Hall established the Bloomfield Ironworks at Tipton in the Black Country, and within a few years, this new approach, called wet puddling, had become the standard method across Britain. and then across Europe. Cheap iron from low-quality ores could now be refined into perfectly serviceable wrought iron. The bottleneck loosened, and the timing of that loosening lined up with the single biggest infrastructure project of the 19th century, the railroads. In 1820, an engineer named John Birkinshaw at the Bedlington Ironworks in Northumberland patented a method for rolling wrought iron into rails 15 feet long. Before Birkinshaw, railways used either wooden tracks, which splintered under heavy loads, or cast iron rails that were barely 3 feet long and cracked constantly under the weight of a steam locomotive. Cast iron was too brittle for the job, but wrought iron, the product of the puddling furnace, had the flexibility to absorb the stress of a rolling locomotive without snapping. George Stephenson understood this immediately. Even though Stephenson held the rights to the best cast iron rail design on the market at the time, he abandoned it. He chose Birkinshaw's wrought iron rails for the Stockton and Darlington Railway, which opened on September 27, 1825, and became the first public railway to use steam locomotives for hauling both freight and passengers. That single decision launched the railroad age. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway followed in 1830. By 1840, Britain had over 1,500 miles of railway. By 1850, the network had swelled to 6,000 miles, and the story was the same across the Atlantic. The first puddling furnace in the United States started operating around 1817 near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where cheap coal from Appalachian mines fed a growing cluster of ironworks. American mills in the 1830s and 40s were turning out puddled iron for canal construction, bridge building, and the first wave of railroad expansion. Until 1844, American railroads imported all their rails from British mills, because domestic production simply could not keep up with demand. After that, American puddling works began producing their own wrought iron rails, and the network exploded westward. Every one of those rails, British and American, was wrought iron. Every one of them came from a puddling furnace. And it was not just rails. Puddled iron built the bridges that carried those railways across rivers and valleys. It framed the train stations and engine sheds. It formed the boiler plates of the steam locomotives themselves. The iron water pipes running under the streets of London and Paris were puddled iron. The structural skeleton of the Crystal Palace, built for the Great Exhibition in 1851, was puddled iron. And some of the most recognizable structures in history owe their existence to the same process. The Eiffel Tower in Paris, finished in 1889, was constructed from puddled wrought iron. The original internal framework of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor, engineered by Gustave Eiffel, before the copper skin was attached, was puddled iron. These were not steel buildings. Steel was just arriving. These were monuments built from iron that had been stirred by hand in a coal-fired furnace. But the man who made all of this possible never saw any of it. Henry Cort's ruin came from a financial partnership he entered years before his patents made history. When Cort bought the Fontley Ironworks, he needed capital to fund his experiments. He found a backer in Adam Jellicoe, a high-ranking official in the Royal Navy's pay office. Jellicoe invested large sums in the business, and in return, his son Samuel became Cort's partner. For more than a decade, the arrangement worked well enough. Cort developed his rolling mill and his puddling furnace. He filed his patents. In 1787, he struck a deal with the Welsh ironmaster Richard Crawshay, in which all iron produced under Cort's patents would generate a royalty of 10 shillings per ton. Then Adam Jellicoe died in 1789, and the truth came out. The money Jellicoe had funneled into the ironworks had been stolen from the Royal Navy. Years of embezzlement skimmed from public funds. Cort had no part in the crime and no knowledge of it. But the Crown did not care. The Admiralty revoked Cort's patents, seized the ironworks, and demanded repayment. Cort was ruined. The irony was brutal. With the patents now void, ironmasters across Britain and Europe could use Cort's puddling process without paying a penny. Richard Crawshay, the Welsh ironmaster who had struck that 10 shillings per ton royalty deal just 2 years earlier, no longer owed Cort anything. Crochet's works at Cyfarthfa went on to become one of the largest ironworks in the world. Others followed. The technology spread faster than it ever could have under a licensing arrangement, precisely because the inventor had been stripped of his rights to it. The entire British iron industry benefited from Cort's misfortune. Cort himself saw nothing from any of it. He spent his remaining years living on a small annual pension of about £200, a modest sum even by the standards of the 1790s, struggling to support his wife Elizabeth and their 13 children. He tried to get Parliament to restore his patents or offer some kind of compensation for the fortune his inventions had created. It never happened. He died on May 23, 1800, in London, at roughly 60 years of age. The major papers did not run an obituary. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement of what he had done. 50 years later, the Times of London published an editorial calling him the father of the iron trade. Lord Sheffield had actually said something similar back in 1786, arguing that Cort's innovations, alongside James Watt's steam engine, were more important than the loss of the American colonies. But by the time the wider public recognized what Cort had done, the man was half a century in the ground. The puddling furnace outlived Cort by more than a century and a half, but its dominance ended in 1856 when Henry Bessemer patented his converter. Bessemer built a tall cylindrical vessel with holes at the bottom for blowing air into molten pig iron. When he ran his first experiments, the results were explosive. Flames erupted from the top of the cylinder. Molten slag and iron sprayed into the air. Bessemer himself described the converter as a volcano in a state of active eruption. But once the fireworks died down, what remained in the vessel was steel. The oxygen in the air had burned away the carbon, and the chemical reactions generated so much heat that no external fuel was needed beyond the initial melting. The process handled 15 tons of pig iron in a single batch. 15 tons in about 20 minutes. Compare that to the puddling furnace, which took 2 to 3 hours to refine maybe 600 to 900 pounds. Bessemer's output was not wrought iron. It was steel, a material stronger, harder, and more versatile than anything puddling could produce. The puddling furnace simply could not compete at that scale. It had been born with a hard ceiling, the physical limits of a single worker at the furnace door. You could not stretch past that ceiling. You could only build more furnaces, and at some point, even that stopped making economic sense against a machine that processed 30 times the volume with no human hands inside. By the 1880s, steel from Bessemer converters and open hearth furnaces was replacing wrought iron in nearly every major application. Steel rails replaced wrought iron rails. Steel beams replaced wrought iron beams. Steel plates replaced wrought iron plates in shipbuilding. The transition happened fast because steel was simply a better material for almost everything, harder, stronger, and cheaper to produce at volume. Puddling went into slow decline, but it did not disappear overnight, and that says something about the material it produced. Wrought iron has a fibrous grain structure, almost like wood, because of the tiny threads of slag that get worked into the metal during the puddling and rolling process. That grain gives wrought iron a unique resistance to fatigue and corrosion. In certain applications, old-fashioned puddled iron lasted longer than the mild steel that replaced it. The last commercial puddling furnaces in Britain kept operating well into the 1950s and even the 1960s, producing small batches for specialized uses, bridge repairs, historic building restorations, chain making. But by then, they were holdovers from another century, staffed by a handful of men practicing a trade that the rest of the world had moved past. For roughly 70 years, though, from the 1780s to the 1850s, the puddling furnace was the single choke point through which all usable iron had to pass. Every railroad that opened before Bessemer ran on puddled iron. Every bridge, every beam, every rivet. The process was not elegant, and it was not kind to the men who performed it. It scaled the only way a human body can scale, by showing up again tomorrow and doing the same punishing work one more time. But it sat at the dead center of the most dramatic industrial expansion the world had ever seen, and for 7 decades, nothing else on Earth could do what it did. Henry Cort died without money or recognition. His puddlers died young, their bodies broken by the work that built the foundations of the modern world underneath them. And the furnace itself was eventually overtaken by something bigger and faster and less reliant on human endurance. But the iron it produced is still standing. The Eiffel Tower is still there, overlooking Paris. The framework inside the Statue of Liberty is still holding. And every time you ride a train along a route that was first laid down in the 1800s, you are following a path that was made possible by molten iron, a 20-pound bar, and a man who would not live to see old age. If you found this interesting, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which forgotten invention you think deserves its own documentary. And if you learned something new, a like really does help more people find this channel.